it's not in a sense the same test, right?
So you got 8 points before. Now each question may be giving you 10 points.
There is score concordance between the existing GMAT and the GMAT Focus online. I'd love to talk a little bit about score concordance, which is something, Jay, that you brought up for GRE. And I'll start with Jay here, and then I'll go to Eric. So Jay, the new GRE, or the shorter GRE, the version that we're currently presenting to students, has the exact same score scale as the GRE that was being previously presented. Mm-hmm. And you shared that, hey, if you're getting a 155 previously, you should be getting a 155 now. And this is something I've had students ask about, and something I've wondered about myself, with the fact that there are fewer questions, that to me indicates like each question maybe has a higher weight, or maybe if you're a student who struggles with timing, maybe that is amplified, across the exam. So I guess the question that I would have is that really true? Is really it accurate that if a student was scoring a 155 before, they should still be scoring a 155, despite the fact that the exam is now much more compressed?
Sure. I will throw out there, shorter does not mean easier. And I've heard that misquoted a number of times in several different sources and podcasts I listen to, that, oh, it's shorter now, it must be easier. No. In fact, each question, you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, you're getting additive points. These are by no means the actual points, but let's say that you got 8 points for a question prior. Don't quote me on that, because I am not a test writer. I don't do that. But let's say you got 8 points before. Now each question may be giving you 10 points because there's less questions to get to that 170 maximum that you can get. So yeah, you do want to make sure that you are spending time with each question. Don't blow them off, because ultimately they will each add more to your score. It's a matter of math. If you're taking the quant section, you should be able to figure that one out.
That makes sense. So for students, yes, you cannot miss as many questions and get the same score on the GRE. Right,
and you may have taken the longer version and the newer version, and I didn't get exactly 155 on both of them. One I did 160, well, you did better one day than the other. You got a test question that stumped you or didn't stump you, whichever direction you went. And that happens. People will take the test multiple times and their score will fluctuate a little bit. That's the nature of taking a test.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's something to bear in mind for students, is that, because there are fewer questions here, if you do get a stumper, that stumper will have more weight, like it will, because there are fewer questions. So each question carries that additional weight.
And in the GRE, you can jump ahead to the next question and don't miss 4 questions that you just never answered because one is stressing you out. Mm-hmm. You've got one, mark it on your scratch paper, whatever, say, go back to question number 4 and move on, because you want as many additive points as you can as you're taking the test.
Mm-hmm. That's so real. And that strategy applies as well to the GMAT. So going back to Eric here, so the GMAT Focus has a different score scale, and that makes sense. There are different sections. It is content-wise and structurally a pretty significantly different exam. So now, instead of being out of 800, we're out of 805. Instead of that total score being based on quant and verbal with separate scores for the other sections, we now have one total score that is based on all 3 of the sections, which is exciting. I think, it was kind of hard to pitch to students, like, you need to care about the AWA and the IR, but maybe not as much because it's not part of the total score. Now everything counts, everything matters. So I wanted to talk a little bit. We were both recently at the GMAT conference, and I got to see some of the research that you did, and I also got to hear about score concordance. And this is something that students, everyone here, you can all access. There is score concordance between the old GMAT, the existing GMAT, and the GMAT Focus online. You can Google it and you can find it. I confirmed it this morning. And I wanted to talk about that. How is this new score scaling different from the old score scaling? And Yeah, how can we think about section scores in particular, especially given that there's a new section?
Yeah, I mean, the new, well, just to take us back a little bit, right? So when we look at, with a new score scale or a revised score scale, it was exactly what you said, because now we're dealing with 3 sections versus 2. We've taken out some content, things like sentence correction, geometry, things like that. We've data sufficiency is now a part of data insights as opposed to being in the quantitative section. So, it's not in a sense the same test, right? It's measuring similar things, right? The question types are the same, but ultimately that total score is now including all 3 sections versus 2 sections. So that's one thing. So the other big thing was that the population of people taking the GMAT, and I assume the same thing with GRE, has changed over the last several decades quite a bit. So what happened was it used to be a natural bell curve, right? That's how we originally was set up, right? Just like we do with the executive assessment and so forth. But it's now skewed right. And so what happens is the averages have been going up for the schools. They're starting to see these tighter bands amongst their candidates. They're having a harder time differentiating amongst those candidates, both at the higher end and other parts as well. So 2 things. One is, and the test didn't get any easier, right? So it's not like the scores were going up because it was easier or any of that. It's just the people that are taking the test are typically higher scoring types of candidates. Anyway, so this was an opportunity though to go back and re-establish that a little bit more normal bell curve. It's not perfect, but it also really allowed for that differentiation for schools to be able to see the differences amongst candidates if they're interested in seeing those sort of minute, differences. Also a way for a candidate to know, hey, look, I'm a little bit better than these candidates, at least on this particular portion of the application. So there are new score scales, but they're concordance tables, as you said. They're available on MBA.com. Anybody can go and look at those. For schools, they're on GMAC.com. But we will list the percentile. We will list the current GMAT, so the GMAT exam, and then also GMAT Focus right next to it. So we recommend schools use and candidates focus on the percentiles, because again, it's not an apples to apples between the current and Focus, right? But the percentile, at least, you really get at how competitive a candidate is and sort of how they measure up. And so in schools, of course, are always looking at, there's certain levels that they feel a little bit uncomfortable with, right? That they just feel like this person's going to probably struggle a little bit more than they need. So we need to provide them with additional support, or ethically, we can't admit this person because they would struggle too much, right? Nobody wants to set anybody up for failure. So the subscores, though, totally different score scale than, it's not even remotely close to what the old score scales were. But there's also concordance tables for those as well.
Love that. I love specifically that you called out using percentiles. This is something, if folks here have watched the live stream I did on the Shorter GRE versus the GMAT Focus, or like, should you take the GRE or the GMAT, I really emphasize percentiles as the way to compare those 2 scores. That's the way schools think about scores, is with percentiles. But I think especially as we're transitioning to a new exam for GMAT, I think the old kind of rules that a lot of people think about, which is my score's got to start with a 7, or whatever, that kind of falls away. And I'm sure there will be new rules as we adjust to the new score scale and new things that people think about. But for now, don't freak out, that the new scores are different. They are different, and you shouldn't apply the old rules to the new scores. Think about percentiles, use concordance tables.
Yeah, and Eric, obviously all that, the reason to change the score scale was based on our feedback from schools. So there's a little bit of pain for them because it is something new, right? They have to get used to it. Jay is obviously not seeing that with GRE. It's probably made it a little bit easier, for that transition. Ours is going to be a little bit more, involved, right? But any change is going to be that way. So it was good feedback from them on that. I would say the other thing too is that I don't think candidates should not think, oh, well, if I'm at the 80th percentile on this test, but I got an 85th percentile on that test, I should submit that test. It's not always the case, right? The schools are just looking at these different things. They have their own internal thresholds that they look at and sort of how they would rank them, because there are different types of candidates that would take these exams. Obviously, there's overlap too, right? But my point is there are some nuances there.
Awesome. And we'll talk more about different types of candidates that'll take different tests. Jay, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add in there that keep in mind there's a very different population that takes the two tests. And when you're looking at the percentiles, when you're looking at a GRE percentile, for example, you're looking at people that are applying to engineering, science, astrophysicists take the GRE. And then there's liberal arts as well that's thrown in there. So it's not, if you make a 90 percentile on the GMAT, that's a 90 percentile on the GRE as well. In fact, what schools admissions offices do is they compare how have GRE test takers performed in our program in the past, and how have GMAT test takers performed in the past. So you can't just say, oh, it's exactly one to the other, because it's frankly not.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And honestly, I think I'm going to shift my advice slightly to students based on that, to look, okay, you got to look program by program, you got to look at each of the classes to see how does GMAT compare to GRE, and then use that to inform. That was really useful for me personally.